Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to another API review. This is the first of the year, obviously. We have not done, I think, API reviews in 3 weeks now, I believe. And so a few things popped up, but actually less than I thought. So I guess that means lots of people had good vacation days. Let's start with the first red one here. Who has context on this one? I believe we talked about this before. Remember.
I have very small context on this in the sense that I read it desperately when you sent out your invite. And then I did a little bit of research. I get the problem. I don't think there's any real concern with this, other than the fact that I think the architecture order seems kind of weird, but maybe that doesn't really matter.
Interesting. Yeah, we reviewed recently, I think, another addition to the architecture enum, I believe.
Yeah, it was S390X.
Oh, yeah.
That's relatively recent. This is more or less in the same vein. It's individuals wanting to expose and add function support architectures, and we're not in charge of that, but they would like an expressive API and something that is official.
I've never heard of this. What is Loom?
This is a I think relatively new architecture. I mean, relatively new in the sense this century. But it's put out by Longsung Technology. It's a company. It's a Chinese company. I don't know much about it other than that. It's based off of MIPS, if that's any helpful. If that's helpful, they're trying to support this. They're trying to port the runtime over to MIPS. There is an accompanying API. There's an accompanying PR, and you can find that it's in the actual issue, but I'll put it in the chat here as well. It is a PR to add more or less similar support that was added for the S390X work. Just ability to build, and people can do what they wish.
Yeah, that makes sense. The only thing I'm doing right now is I'm trying to find the previous API approval for S390X, because it looks like we only added that to architecture. We did not add this to the machine enum.
Well, okay, so that's a fair point. The machine enum is for PE images, and I don't, which does exist in there are PE images that actually have this. If you look at the PE image, you look at the PE spec, these two values were added. I am not entirely sure that S390X has been added, but I haven't validated that.
It doesn't look like it.
Yeah, I don't see it in the official docs.
Then that would be why I think that was probably just not done.
Maybe it was added in a different name.
Perhaps.
Maybe it would qualify as PowerPC.
Yeah, there's PowerPC Little Onion and PowerPC with floating point support.
Unless I'm misremembering, and S390 is not PowerPC, and it's the other one.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know whether we map every value that is defined here in the docs, but
we don't. I don't believe there's alpha or any of these other chips. So
yeah, I guess my care level is moderately low. I mean, we can just add it to both of these enums, and then if at a later stage realized, oh, we should have added S390X, whatever the name was, to the machine one as well, we can still do that. So it doesn't really prevent us from doing that. And then the enum values themselves are probably Looks like they are mapped already to the spec anyway, so that would be pretty easy. Does anybody have any concerns with the names?
I mean, if you don't know the name of the company, the name looks like it's a typo, but it's the name of the company and the name of the architecture. So
Yeah, the docs, I assume, would just explain it.
It's a bit weird to have the name Arch in the name for the enum, but
it is the name of the architecture. So
yeah.
Should we consider doing say that people fork the runtime, right, and then port this to some architecture that we're not aware of? Does it ever make sense to have just a custom field maybe at the very end of the enum?
Well, so first of all, I'd be concerned about putting custom at the very end right now because there's already another proposal in the pipeline to add another entry here.
Well, I think you would hard code the value of that
Yeah.
value.
Yeah,
it's like
-1.
-1.
I mean, like int.max value.
Yeah.
Or something. Or -1, because why not?
yeah. I mean, the problem with that proposal is that, I mean, I don't know, like, how do we, like, where does architecture get exposed today?
Isn't this through operating system, or am I maybe mistaken here?
Because it kind of depends on how the code that exposes that works, right?
Yeah, runtime information dot process architecture. It's not operating system. It's runtime information.
Yeah. And then also OS architecture.
Yeah.
And so we can never run on Loong Arch 32? Is that basically what's happening?
Yeah. So Loong Arch 32, the company created, but they did not port .NET to it.
Yeah. So what's the behavior of the APIs that we have when somebody's working on a system that's not in this enum?
I don't know where all uses are, but I know we hit a bunch of issues with the classic. Well, if it's none of these, it's x86.
Right.
And so now,
0.
right, exactly. So that becomes a general concern.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
that's kind of
and
why I
looking at
had
it-
suggested that,
Yeah.
like, even if we don't have a value that represents custom, like, we at least need some kind of thing in place, some kind of best practice to tell people, if you're doing this on a novel architecture, this is what you should do for this property.
I don't think we should do anything like that. I think people who are doing something on a novel architecture should propose a value be added to this enum, and we go through the step of officializing a constant integer for it. Otherwise, you're going to run into issues where two independent companies go and decide their own thing. They both grab the value -2, and now there's conflict. It's trivial for us to add architectures even if we don't officially support them to the enum here, provided that someone supports them. It's the same thing that like Vulkan does with extensions when you're looking at Intel, AMD, NVIDIA, and every other company that wants to add an extension. They take a proposal and they officialize a constant number to represent that extension for that company.
Does this mean that we now become a registry even for things that we don't officially support?
Yeah, we're IANA.
Yeah.
Yeah, the argument that I would make is I think having the idea of an unknown architecture is a good idea. And then the architectures that get specific values in the enum are ones that are either Microsoft supported or community supported in the .NET runtime repo. So they are part of the product that you can build out of the repo. And if some company builds it for some other system, then it's not in our repo, and we don't have anything referencing that new architecture. So it's like a fork, and then they can contribute back and ask for it to be added.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like probably what we want is wherever the place is that populates this, have a comment that says if you're a prototype or if you're an architecture that's not supported, return -1 or something. It's just as a comment, because the moment we put the word custom or other or unknown or anything, as soon as someone writes some code for it, it's now a bomb.
Yeah.
It's, oh, I was doing some stuff on LoongArch 32 and that wasn't added yet, so that hit other, and now I'm depending on other, and there's no good recovery from this. And oh, it turns out this code actually got hit because somebody else was playing with something on an S390X32, or the S390 that's not X. And it's like, so having a named value for garbage goes here, or sorry, unknown things go here. I think that'll actually be net bad for what this is. So, a community best, or a extensions best practice, sure. Use -1, add it to your enum, read it by name, add the proposal to get your thing added. Is my suggestion.
Okay. I was only offering the idea because I don't like how we've done what Aaron mentioned, and basically x86 is our unknown.
Yeah, and we could put an unknown. It's just the moment somebody says if the type is unknown, then now everything inside that is probably wrong.
Yeah.
And it's not like, OS versions where there's a whole lot of churn. It's architectures are relatively rare.
Yeah.
All right, looks like we're happy then, right?
Is there a reason
Are we
we're not
ever
going to
happy?
add LongArch 32? Is this that we hate 32-bit systems now?
No, because nobody is having support for it. The company only supports 64.
I thought I saw the 32 on Wikipedia.
Well, so the 32 one is only in the P spec, but nobody supports that.
So
Yeah.
I think
They started with it and then decided nope.
Okay.
I think the point here is there is a PR to support the building of it, not anything to do with 32.
Right. So right now somebody wants to add.
Yeah, and a PR
64.
exists for that actual build.
The only thing that's kind of odd is if we ever support .NET on it, then the members are out of order, but I think we live.
Yeah.
Yeah. Before we go on to the next proposal, do we want to cover the other proposal to add another value to the architecture enum, or do we want to leave that for next week? It's further down the list.
Yeah, we can talk about this right now. I think this was the only red issue we had. So at this point, they're all equal. Which one was that?
I actually also have an issue that should be marked as blocking for perf work, but it can wait until after this other tiny issue.
So this is ARM6.
Yeah. So basically for this one, when .NET came to ARM32, we defined ARM as ARM v7 with virtual floating point type 3 for the ABI, and the Mono team has been working on, for community support, porting Mono down to ARM v6 with the VFP v2 floating point support, and that's an effectively completely different architecture. So our ARM is ARM v7. This is adding support for ARM v6.
And there's no corresponding P file flag for that?
No, for PE, it's just ARM for the whole thing, everywhere. Even though compatibility between v6 and v7 is extremely difficult or borderline impossible, depending on your processor emulation.
Yeah, the lowercase v throws me off a little bit, but I don't have strong feelings here.
Because their branding is big, capital A, capital R, capital M, lowercase v, I think, and then we .metified the name, which we could make the v big to indicate it's a new word, but that also seems a little weird.
Yeah.
At that point, we're almost just inverting the casing of the branding.
Tilde case.
Then I guess we go with this one. And then if somebody has problems with that, then let us know. Guess we can remove untriaged now as well. All right. So, Tana, which one is yours?
The last one in the list. This is for some of the ARM64 perf work. So basically, we already reviewed and approved, and I've finished implementing the cross-platform vector APIs on Vector 64, 128, and 256 of T that parity what we expose on Vector of T. There are a few additional APIs that apply to hardware intrinsics in particular that would be useful to expose for the cross-platform functionality. These are extract most significant bits, which functions like move mask, and then load and store intrinsics. I called out where how these function on various platforms. So for extract most significant bits, that is literally just move mask on x86. On ARM hardware, this is emulated using an and, a shift right, an add pairwise, and then a 2-scalar call. So it ends up being approximately 3 or 4 instructions with a JIT optimization that the shift right can be excluded in certain cases where the input is a comparison. WASM defines this as bit mask, and it on various architectures functionally works the same way. And then for the load and store APIs, they work exactly as expected. They mirror the names of the underlying platform APIs. The new APIs for here would be the load unsafe and store unsafe. These handle a scenario that's been long requested by users, which is we'd like to be able to use hardware intrinsics in scenarios where pinning isn't desirable. In our own BCL code, we work around this with some helper APIs and using unsafe add and things like that. This just makes a official pattern for trivializing that, which is there's load unsafe, takes a ref t, and it loads a vector 128 from that, and then one that also takes an index. And so this avoids the need to also call unsafe add, which makes the code less readable, bloats IL size, hinders inlining, etc.
Tanner, you cut out for a sec.
Where did I cut out?
I heard
the
it.
last like 10 seconds.
So there's load unsafe, which works just like unsafe read unaligned, except directly containable, inlineable. It's a proper intrinsic, and then load unsafe, which takes the ref t and the inuit index, which works like a unsafe add followed by unsafe read unaligned. And both of these exist to cover the gap of making the code more readable and allowing you to trivially load and store vector types to refs without having to pin, without having to make the code unreadable by having unsafe add shoved everywhere, etc.
And just to confirm, if it does not say aligned, it is unaligned, correct?
Correct.
To load and store.
Correct, which is exactly how the actual APIs on Advanced SIMD and SSE, AVX, etc. work.
And the expectation is if you're calling load align non-temporal, you have some idea what it does?
Yes. Non-temporal is the official word basically everywhere to mean this is a hint to specify the CPU can decide to not pollute the cache. So in the case where you're doing like a mem copy for more than 128 bytes, you're going to end up blowing 2 cache lines and that's generally undesirable. So most memcopy implementations use non-temporal loads and stores there to avoid constantly blowing cache lines. And then at the bottom of this list, there's another set here for shuffle APIs.
I have a quick question on the unsafe ones.
Yes.
So it's a ref of t, but you're gonna either read or write past that one t, right?
Correct. Just like with the pointers, and that's why I've got unsafe in the name.
The assumption is the things to the quote unquote to the right of that address is also t's.
Yes. There's no good way to expose an API that takes the element type as a ref and indicates that it loads a vector without just taking the vector type. But if you have the vector type, then you should just deref the ref rather than using weird APIs.
Yeah, the way that we write this today is really painful because we do a lot of unsafe.as from the T to the byte and then use that in order to pass that to the load unaligned APIs. Like this proposal would make that so much cleaner.
Yeah, makes it and less error prone. So it solves the long-standing ask there of let us do this.
Yeah.
So one question I have is you have store ones that take a pointer where you store, but you don't take a pointer for the source. So the assumption is you always have to load it first before you can store it.
Right. You're going to you fundamentally have to load before you store. Even on x86, there's nothing that does memory to memory operations. You have to load a register and then store that register into the destination memory address.
Why are the stores static instead of instance?
1, efficiency, and 2, because that's how all the other hardware intrinsic APIs work.
Yeah, I wonder if the confusion there was that normally we would consider this value because we're passing in the value that should be stored at the address. That's what source is in this world.
Right. Yeah, I was just wondering if there is one that basically takes 2 addresses. I was assuming that we would have an intrinsic, but it sounds like that doesn't exist. It always goes into the register first, and then it goes from there to whatever address you wanted.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, we can call it value. I'm fine with that too, but also source makes sense.
Source is the name we're using in the existing store APIs, so that's why it's used here.
We use address for the destination usually?
Yep, that's what we're doing for both ARM and x86, x64.
Yeah, the only thing that similar to what Jeremy was asking is we have extension methods on these types as well. Should the extract most significant bits maybe be an extension method?
It could be, as could store, if we reordered the parameters. I'm not sure it's worthwhile, but I don't have a particular preference. It's a non-breaking change to make it an extension method.
Yeah, I feel like for the actual ISA mapping things, we're using more ISA terms. But if this is the more platform friendly, easier to see, then maybe here we want to match what we would do for a span API, which is source comma destination, and use those words instead of source and address.
So it'd be load source and store this vector value and then t destination.
Well, this vector source, but yeah.
Okay. That seems fine to me.
Sorry, so would you then also make extract most significant bits an extension method or not?
Yeah, if we're trying to make them more friendly in that way, then it makes sense to do it. And people who don't want to use it as an extension method can still just do vector 256 dot.
Right.
Yeah, I don't have strong opinions on whether they're on the type or in an extension method. These are all T. Oh, these are the helper types for working with the T's. So these are the reason that these are static here is because they're not on the type.
You also don't want them to be instance methods because instance method means that the first parameter is taken by ref, and that hurts perf for vectors where you want these to be registered.
Fair enough. Yeah, so I don't. If vector 128 non-t is the extension container for vector 128 of t, then making them all extension methods here seems, I don't know, polite.
Yeah, that seems fine to me.
I mean, we have a mixture already. I mean, not everything is an extension there. I mean, all the create ones, for example, are obviously statics. But then all the other ones are extensions because it just seems more logical, I guess.
Well, like load can't be an extension because it's a factory.
Yeah.
But
yeah, load is like.
But the stores, my question of why isn't it instance, basically then moves into, okay, well, let's make it extension so it looks like instance.
Yep, and that seems fine to me.
Is there perf implications at all with switching those around?
No. Okay. The only perf implication would be if it was an actual instance method.
Yeah.
And then at the bottom in additional notes, there's also the shuffle APIs.
Do you want to go over the shuffle APIs now, or?
Yeah, we've got time, and it took about 5 minutes to review these ones, so I wasn't sure how much time we'd have or if we'd get to them at all. But since we have no other blocking issues, then being able to start work on unblocking some of the SIMD PRs that are coming in, making sure they can support ARM, etc., is much goodness.
Okay. I have, if you're ready, I have a preliminary question on the shuffle APIs then.
Yeah, I'm going to wait till Immo scrolls down, though, so everyone can see them.
Sorry, I was just trying to fix the other things up. All right.
Okay, what was your question?
So, for the indices, you're taking the same data type, be it signed or unsigned, for the most part?
Except for float and double, where you
float,
have to take an integer.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, because in float and double, you've said we're taking signed integers, does it make sense just to take signed integers everywhere else as well, or is that complicating things?
It doesn't complicate things too much, and I don't think it particularly matters. I just took signed for double and float because double and float themselves are signed, so it made the most sense to parity there. So the principle behind these are element reordering APIs. They allow you to take the elements and reorder them effectively any way you want, including duplicating certain elements, etc. Every platform supports this, and every platform kind of has different names. On x86, the names are shuffle and permute. On WASM and an LVM, they're called shuffle. WASM also has one named swizzle, which is a variant of shuffle that takes one element rather than 2 vectors. On ARM64, they call this a vector table lookup. Because most platforms use shuffle, that's the name that I went with here for these APIs. But the principle is that they take a vector and then they take a set of indices. Each index is constrained to, for the ones that take one vector, it's constrained between 0 and count -1. And it is an element-wise selection of, in the result, the result index 0 is vector get element index get element 0. So you use the 0th index to select from vector the element that you want in the 0th element of the result, and then you do that for every element.
Right. So like big endian, little endian would be you pass in a vector 32 of byte, and you give it 3210.
Yes.
Okay.
And then for
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say for the 2 element, it functionally works the same, except you have a lower vector and an upper vector, and the indices go between 0 and count times 2 minus 1. So you can select any element from either vector, where elements 0 through 15, for example, are for lower, and elements and indices 16 through 31 apply to. I'm selecting this from upper. The general expectation is that indices comes from a vector 128 create that takes all constant inputs. You can still operate without constant inputs, but the optimizations the JIT can do at that point are more limited. When there are all constant inputs, then we actually have a lot of optimization opportunities where we can emit more efficient instructions or reduce the number of operations that are required to do the shuffle, in many cases down to just a single instruction.
And so these shuffle ones only exist for vector 128?
No, they also exist for vector 64 and vector 256. For vector 64, there are no long, U-long, or double variants because there's only one element, so there's no point in shuffling those. And for vector 256, it calls out that it works exactly like a full, it works exactly like the vector 64 and vector 128 variants. It does not work like x86 shuffling, which generally speaking does not allow cross-lane, meaning you cannot shuffle between the lower and upper 128-bit vectors. There are instructions to allow cross-lane shuffling on x86, but they're generally not what you want.
Do these APIs across all architectures have the behavior that if the index has the high bit set, then the destination vector gets 0 for that element?
No, that's ARM specific. And that's only ARM specific on vector table lookup extension.
Well, because I'm thinking, I think the x86 shuffle permute or shuffle instruction has this behavior too, and I know I depend on it in a few places, but it sounds like for these APIs, it sounds like if the index is out of range between, say, 0 and 15, then the behavior is undefined.
We could either make it, we'd probably make it well-defined, and we'd either make it do zeroing or throw.
God, I was about to say I don't like platform-specific behavior on a platform-agnostic API.
Yeah.
And that's, I agree, but now we're talking about like potentially having additional operations that the caller might not be expecting.
If they want bare metal, call the bare metal API.
Yeah.
Okay.
But if, Tanner's assertion that the indices are going to be populated with the literal, then any extra checks are just going to go away. It's only when you have dynamic behavior that you get the extra, oh, this was too big, so now we're going to throw, or we're going to zero, or whatever it is we feel like writing down.
And this is the exact same behavior that WASM has standardized on these APIs for its, it is functionally agnostic because it's WASM, but it's the same behavior they've settled on for their APIs.
Okay, and then because we talked about it on the previous issue, I'll just ask the question of, are all of these pure static, or should they be extensions off of the source? I don't have an opinion. I just need to ask the question.
The one element shuffles I think would make sense as extensions. The 2 element shuffles, I think it could potentially be confusing. Would we still call the second vector upper, or would we call it other?
That's fair.
I'm fine with making an extension method, and I think we could make it work. If we make it an extension, I'm not positive on what we'd call the second vector parameter for the 2 vector shuffle.
So can you read over the ones that are copied in, that they're all what you're asking for?
Yes, they look correct.
Well, in your stores, I think At least my suggestion was instead of source and address, we use source and destination to match what we would call it if it was a spam.
Oh yeah, and then load use source as well instead of address.
So load would use what? Source?
Source instead of address.
And then the other one would be
Destination. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it would be weird to have the shuffles as a mix of extension and not, so we'll just leave them as all not, and if someone wants to change that in the future, we can do so.
Yeah.
Levi, rereading the WASM spec, WASM also chooses 0 if the index is outside the range.
Okay.
So given that x86 does that for certain scenarios, that ARM has the support via lookup extension and WASM has that, we should probably make that the behavior rather than throwing as well.
All right, so I updated this. Now it should reflect what we want.
Looks correct to me.
All right, then I think we can move on to the next one.
I can speak to it. It's pretty simple. Basically, we've had the thread static attribute since the beginning of .NET. It's only relevant on static fields. If you put it on an instance field, it's silently no ops, which is not what you want. So the primary purpose of the analyzer would be just warn if you put thread static on an instance field. There are various things you could have meant. You might have meant for it to be a static field instead of instance. You might have meant for it to be instance, in which case you need to use something like thread local. So we could have a fixer that, offered to add static or potentially even switched it to be a thread local, but that's more involved. The second piece of this would be a diagnostic for you're using thread static, you're using it on a static, but you have a field initializer, so you write private static int I equals 42. On a thread static, that's only going to affect the very first thread that initializes that field. Every other thread is going to get the default value. So we'd also fire a diagnostic to say, is this really what you meant? Did you really mean to have an initializer here?
Wow. I would have not guessed that. Makes sense, though.
My proposal was that, which is a little bit below, is that we fire a warning level diagnostic if you put thread static on instance field, because that is simply wrong, provably wrong. It's absolutely not doing whatever you expected it to do. It's not doing it. And then an info level diagnostic if you specified an initial value, because maybe it's not a problem, but you should know about it.
And then are we also recommending on this the fixer for the info level diagnostic, which is to remove the initializer?
That's a good idea. Although that's only a partial fix. The real fix is if you were setting it to something, it's because you need it to be that. So there's probably some kind of lazy initialization you need to do elsewhere. I don't know if we want to have a partial fix.
That's fair. We can always add a fixer later.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it also isn't exactly the kind of thing that you should ever then say, oh, apply this everywhere, because of what you just mentioned of, are you even dealing with it?
Yeah.
All right, and so I don't remember what the categories are called.
It should be whatever the reliability one is, I would assume. I don't remember what it is.
Let's just claim that's what it is, and then if it's not that, it's fine. All right. Where's context on this one? I guess it's Jeremy.
Actually, it's Levi. I've not even read the proposal.
I'm here too.
Yeah.
Oh,
and Kevin.
Hello.
Yeah, let's let Kevin talk to this, since I think he was shopping it a bit for it.
So this is just furthering our design proposal for making crypto a little bit easier in .NET, which is the background on this one is we don't have a very straightforward way to hash a stream of data. So the three ways that we have of hashing something now are the new one-shots that have appeared steadily over the past couple of years, incremental hash, and then our instance-based, hash algorithms. I would propose that we add one-shots for streams since they exist on the instance-based hash algorithms. And this would add it to both the just plain hash algorithms and the HMAX.
So one of the benefits that we had with the static hashes, ignoring the HMAC ones, but the static simple digests is on many OSs, we don't need to allocate anything. Like there's no state. We just call their static method and we get the answer or function since
Correct.
It's not native code, or managed code. But with the stream one, there has to be state. And
yes.
So
not necessarily. You could imagine that the implementation says, like, is the stream a memory stream or something else where I can just read the whole thing at once, right?
We could special case memory stream, but any custom stream, any wrapping stream, a file stream, all of these things we're now going to have to call read. So we have the local array, we have the state, we have the incremental calls. So Levi, you're usually the one who thinks it's weird if an overload has vastly different notions of performance characteristics. If you're not bothered by it, then I'm not. But
oh, no. I wouldn't call this vastly different. Like an allocation in my mind is not vastly different.
Okay. And then the other concern with streams is usually what happens if there's a partial read, but everything here, like the hash data that returns an array has no fault state other than the OS craps out on us. The ones that write to a destination, as long as they pre-validate the destination length, then they're good. So really my only concern is that the span ones are really like just a straight OS call that literally walks over the data, and the stream ones they have to walk the stream.
Yeah, but if you look at a lot of the use cases, like I'm reading this from a file, for instance, I just go file.open and pass the file stream directly to this method. Like I as a caller am not going to want to turn that into a span first. Like it might be too difficult for me to do that.
That's fair.
I think the other thing though is I mean, we could rent from CryptoPool, and that would kind of, I know that's kind of an allocation, but I mean, if we're just renting from CryptoPool, filling the buffer, and then appending that to the incremental hash or stream or whatever, then it'll allocate depending on the pool's availability.
Right, but I mean so that'll be a non-alloc, but we're still going to have we created an OS hash state. So push on a safe handle, do a bunch of work, pop off the safe handle.
Sure.
Sure.
So
it goes from stateless to stateful, and that's that is a boundary.
Have a few handles, and technically we do that on Windows 7 and anyways, because we don't have the one shots, so it's not a real hard guarantee that they don't allocate, but for any modern platform we do.
Yeah, and it's still O of 1 even with the allocation. So.
Yep. So, again, that was my only real concern. Is basically these are amortized straight calls on one, and this is a loop. And if we think that's fine, then
The only source of, I think, discussion that we hadn't really nailed down from the proposal in terms of straightforwardness is for the HMAX one, should the key be a span or a memory?
Yeah, and I think we decided that it would be too difficult to make it a span, given the calling patterns that consumers tend to use.
What we take in incremental hash?
Well, in incremental hash, we take a byte array and a span. The difference is incremental hash doesn't actually have any async members on it, so you're not going to be in an async context. And span doesn't work super well when callers are in async contexts right now. So if we have hash data async, and you have a HMAC key, hash data async, you're probably going to be in an async context, and you can't even have a local that's a read-only span.
Right, but you could have the array be implicitly converted, or you could take a memory and call pass.span. I mean, we can also we could overload it, but I think that would violate our general guidelines.
There is nothing stopping it from being read-only span, other than my impression was it's a little weird because the only way you can actually pass something to it is depending on an implicit conversion or calling memory.span or something.
Yeah, I mean, you can explicitly write .as_span.
That would work too.
Yeah, so I mean the high level heuristic of take span if you can and memory if you can't means we should take span. But I don't do enough async programming to know if there's a real usability problem there.
I think we decided there is, unfortunately.
I mean, the general assumption is that somebody who doesn't care about span uses the overload that does not take the memory, right? So they're just happy with the allocation that you get.
Yeah, I mean, we could certainly do byte array and span as overloads. If you have a memory, you have to pass .span at the call site. Then if you have a byte array, you just pass it through.
No, I thought that we actually tried that and received compilation errors.
No, I got it working.
We overload on byte array and span all the time.
No, I meant in an API that returns task where we expect a caller to await it.
Okay, so the async method itself, I'm hoping Steve will correct me if I'm wrong, it can't use both the async keyword and take a span parameter, I think.
That's correct.
But if the public async member is not declared with the async keyword, because it does, argument validation that the destination is big enough, and then calls an async helper, it can have created the incremental hash for you, pass that to the async helper, and then the spans are gone.
Yes, I swear we actually tried that and received an error at the call site, though.
No, that should work fine.
I think what Levi is saying is that
the call sites, if you were trying to use a span local in the calling async method, you're going to get an error about the calling async method using a span local.
Yeah, I think that was the thing, right? So if the caller has to await the call, then you can never pass in a span, basically.
I think they can pass in a span as a parameter. They just can't have it as a named state.
I
Or
see.
you can't depend on the implicit conversion from a byte array to a span. That does work. The only thing is, I think it just basically prevents you from having a local that is
Gotcha.
a span.
You also can't have parameters of type span. I just put together something in SharpLab, and I'll share the link in the chat.
Right, but the public method would be public static value task of int hash data async. It would not have async in the. It would not use the async keyword in the public member.
Right.
So that can take the span, consume the data out of the span to create the helper that it needs from the OS, then pass that to an actual method using the word async.
So I just posted in chat an example of code that should succeed but fails.
Yep. No,
And
that fails because the call site has a local called the span. You can't
The
have
local
a local
does not
span.
survive across the await boundary, though.
Yeah, but the compiler's
Doesn't
not smart
matter.
enough
The
to
compiler
care.
doesn't recognize it. If you have a local, regardless of whether it survives an await boundary, it fails.
Yeah, every named variable goes or gets a field on the state machine, and that's what fails to compile. So you can't name it.
Yeah. You also can't have a parameter on a method that's async. So
Right.
I don't know how people would call this.
But you basically, massive hand waving, should not have public async, because validation exceptions are supposed to come before you enter the state machine instead of after you enter the state machine.
Yeah, and that would be fine for us. We would always validate on the front end.
So yeah, I'm looking up to see if we wrote a guideline that said don't do this thing even if you can.
Yeah, and the sample that Steve gave compiles fine, where, like you said, you don't have the named local. You only you have the span instantiated only temporarily as a.
So then what's actually useful for the caller? Like if we only have a span one, that might not be super useful. So we would always have memory and span, at which point might as well just only have memory, right?
For crypto APIs, the reason that span is interesting is because it allows you to keep the key fully on the stack via stack-alloc. And ASP.NET does this all over the place inside of its own APIs.
Right. Except
we would not be able to do that here.
But you can't do that if you're in an async context.
Correct. Even if the stack-alloc would not survive across the await boundary. Like if we had a smarter compiler, we would be able to do the patterns that we're trying to do.
Right.
But the compiler doesn't recognize that the span does not survive.
Of course, how do you have a HMAC key that, I guess you could have input it from somewhere. Yeah,
Right.
So technically speaking,
you derive it via PBKDF, for instance.
Yeah, we said if it, what I wrote in the book is that if it's an async method, always use memory instead of span. This is an interesting case because really this is incremental hash. Like we need to build a thing and then enter the async state machine, and that's a very knife edge case. So
yeah. The first parameter, the key is only used for initialization. Once you've initialized it, the initialization is fully synchronous. And then once you've initialized it, then you consume the data asynchronously.
Right.
So it's combining two operations into a single API, hence the weirdness.
Right.
So then which parameter should it take? Just memory of byte for now?
Secret of byte. Anyway. Memory of byte, or maybe just byte array.
I mean, I'm fine with byte array. I mean, that's probably what you have anyways, but
yeah. The problem with taking byte array is, again, if you're using something like PBKDF, you've probably created both an HMAC and an encryption key inside the same byte array, and you want to slice it. So, memory. Yeah, I mean, we use memory for other APIs. May as well just take it here.
Works for me.
Yeah.
Anything else? Or, I mean, I assume it's just rinse and repeat pattern, right?
Yeah, and the only other thing I guess I want to clarify for the non-async ones that are HMAC and they accept a key, those will continue to accept a span. So the HMAC key for synchronous ones are span because there's no async context and it's very easy to use.
Right.
For this async ones, will continue to accept the memory.
Yep.
Read-only memory.
So I don't know how today we feel about if HMAC is high level enough that we should automatically overload the span with byte array for ease of understanding, or
why wouldn't you
think
just
we're getting into the nitty gritty?
I mean, you can still call the other API that doesn't take an argument, and then we allocate the byte array for you, right? That's the
No. So this is so if you scroll down to like HMAC MD5, I assume they're alphabetical, so it'll be the first one.
Yep.
And if you're looking at it, then the team stopped scrolling. But so what we're talking about is the key parameter.
So, I see what you're saying. Not the destination.
So the question is, should we automatically overload those to take read-only span and byte array, or do you emo as the arbiter of user friendliness feel that crypto is low level enough that you should understand what a span is?
I mean, the idea of these APIs is to make it not low level, right? The idea of these APIs is to have this one-stop shop experience, right?
To make things a little easier, yeah.
Yeah.
So in the past, Jeremy, I think you've actually given a reason to do both a span and a byte array overload to detect if someone actually passes null in as a parameter, because that would be always invalid.
Yeah, we've also done that in places.
Because it is legal to pass an empty key, but did you actually mean to do that, or did you have a null array that got implicitly converted to an empty key?
Yeah. I mean, the guidance on that is the one that takes the reference type should decide independently whether or not null made sense, instead of just automatically letting the implicit conversion of null to empty work. Yeah. I really hate that implicit conversion.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So that actually is a usability concern here. Do we want to allow people to pass in something that could represent a null key? And I would argue it would be a mistake if somebody were to pass null for a key.
Yeah, so we should just overload all these things to take the read-only span of byte key should be overloaded to be byte array key, and the read-only memory of byte key should be overloaded to be byte array key.
Okay.
We can argue that we don't care. We can say we don't care to do that on the span writing one. Like, if you're writing to a span, you obviously understand what a span is, so you can give me one as input. But I will make an output that's big enough for you and return it seems like we should overload those for usability / correctness.
So it seems like the only thing we need to overload is the first one, though, right? Because the second one already takes a span anyway.
Right.
And then the same argument holds for the
async version.
For the async one, we only overload the first one.
So we're only overloading the ones that return a byte array.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's another way to put it.
Or task of byte array.
Yeah, I was gonna say, or indirectly return a byte array.
That seems fine.
And I assume Steve will assert value task is correct here.
Yeah, I think it's fine.
I think it is, yeah. Actually, Steve, I do have, since you're on the line, I have a related question for you. A lot of these async APIs take cancellation tokens, and I think the idea is that the implementation only honors cancellation for reading from the stream. But remember, there are several operations here. There's reading from the stream, and then there's also processing the data. The cancellation token presumably would not cancel processing the data. Is that an acceptable behavior?
It's up to us. It's fully up to us how aggressive we want to be in respecting cancellation. There are even some synchronous APIs that take a cancellation token and are just doing computation but pull the token every once in a while to allow for responsiveness.
In this case, we're literally passing this buffer to a layer much lower than we are, and none of those layers take cancellation. So if we wanted to respect cancellation, we would have to implement chunking on our part.
We could do that.
I don't know if we have.
I mean, we can just pass it along to the stream that we read from and call it a day. We can do an upfront cancellation check. We could choose to add chunking if we thought it was valuable. And it's dialable. Like we can decide how responsive we want to be.
Yeah.
Levi, just for how the PAL's actually written for these, we're kind of going to end up doing chunking anyway, so it wouldn't matter all that. It wouldn't be a big lift to just say cancellation token is canceled. Okay, bail out of the loop, because that loop already exists.
Yeah. And the stream, you destroyed the stream yourself there, so we don't care. I mean, because we're just going to implement it as pooled 4096 array read and call. Like
not if it's a memory stream.
If it's a memory stream, we will call get underlying get byte array and then hash it, and then we will.
At which point there was zero. Like, yes, we would have never read the cancellation token, except maybe in that case we do throw if cancellation requested as we're doing the get underlying.
I just wanted to call out the possibility that this API takes a cancellation token, but could end up doing several seconds of work.
But not really. Like the buffer that we're going to have inside is going to be 4K, I assume.
Inside a memory stream?
Yeah,
okay, inside a memory stream, you might hash a gig, which is what, 1 second? So I think it's less than that. I think hashing a gig is like 18 milliseconds. So like the CPU work of hashing is 0.
Yeah.
HMACing slightly more expensive, but it's still like this is the fast crypto. Everything else is slow.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Do we generally allow people? Do we generally take parameters for what the chunking read size is in stream drainers, or not?
In the current instance-based stream hashing APIs, we don't. We just hard-coded 4096. I am not aware of any other places in system security crypto where we accept a buffer size as input other than maybe CryptoStream. But
yeah, I mean, so. But those are all going to be old, so it's really this is the meta question of for other IOE things. Have we started saying that it's normal to accept the buffer size, or is it normal to say you get what you get? Steve, Emo, top of your head.
Sorry, I tuned out for a second. Say it one more time.
Is the general pattern for our stream draining APIs these days to be to accept a defaulted parameter of what the chunking size should be, or the internal buffer size, or do we just say you get what we give you as the default stance?
I think the only precedent we have for it is copy to and copy to async. Those are the only ones off the top of my head I can think of that take an optional buffer size, and in that case, it's overloads. There's no default argument. It's if it takes the buffer size argument, we use what you give us, and if it doesn't, we default to some 80K like default.
Yeah. Okay, but your guess is our default is we start from the position of we'll pick a number, and if you complain, then we'll add an overload.
Yes.
Okay.
That is the most common case, is an implementation just says I'm going to use 4K.
Okay. Then that's my last concern, I think.
All right, so what I posted, then we agree with that. There's no more modifications we need to do.
Not from what I see on screen.
You scroll down.
Yeah, the only modifications I made are basically starting here.
So we added overloads for byte array key.
For the ones that return a byte array, yes.
And I assume that parameter ordering is consistent with. I guess it can't be consistent. Well, no, we already have the hash data. So for hash data, we chose key source. On
Right.
track.
Yeah.
Okay.
The only thing that changed is your input material went from a span to an array, but or to a stream, but the otherwise the parameter orders are the same with the cancellation token at the end.
Okay. Ship it. Thank you, Kevin.
So we're good then?
So yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
All right. And done on this one. Yes, I think I'm in support of this. Anybody else?
My only question is we're on a path where we're adding a bunch of these throw helpers. We started with argument null exception dot throw if null. We added a few overloads of that. Then we added object disposed exception dot throw if some condition. Now we're talking about adding one to argument exception. We can continue to do it piecemeal, or we could do a push to see if there's a concrete set. Do we want to add them to argument out of range exception, or are we going to stop here, or just take it as it comes?
Yeah, I mean,
I know in my own libraries, I have an exception utilities class that basically covers all of these throw helpers. And I know tons of people, both low level and not, that have similar helper classes explicitly meant for throwing exceptions. Even the BCL has a ton of them, ranging for things from null to negative integers to this one integer is not within the bounds of the other integer or within the insert bounds of the other integer. One is it has to be less than, and the other one is it has to be less than or equal to, etc. So I think there's still plenty more we could do here and that people would want.
I'm not debating that there's more to do. I'm more commenting on the fact that we're adding them sort of one by one. We've been doing the easy ones, the ones where it's null or it's not, it's null or empty or it's not. We start getting into harder territory when it's what are the set of range validation we want to do. You're right. Every library has its own versions of it. My question is really, do we want to step back and try and come up with a holistic design in advance across all of our argument exceptions or more exceptions in general, or do we just want to kind of do it as they're requested?
I think I would go with the latter, because I feel like there is this, as you said, there's this kind of path of you go into this territory of bay becomes noise, right? Where it's just like, oh yeah, one person needed that, right? Versus if you just go down this path where it's like everybody requests what they actually need, then it's a bit more bounded, I guess. But it does mean that we spent more time on it all up, probably.
I think there's probably a few of them that we could group together in a single pass, and I think most of those go on argument out of range. And they're the throw if zero, throw if negative, throw if not in bounds type.
Yeah, I mean, an interesting thing would be, given the way that our resources work right now from the MS Core Lib explosion, basically find what exception messages are being copied into basically every assembly and then move those to helpers, which would be the arg int neg or whatever silly little short name the you can't give me a negative number is, and similar. The naming on a bunch of these gets weird once we start wanting to distinguish the resource string that goes with them, but certainly if we have a pretty common thing of this can't be less than 0, that's probably all using the same resource string, etc. So if somebody has the time to do that, basically the frequency analysis in the resource tables, then that would tell us what's probably actually common.
Seems like a reasonable activity for someone to do. In the meantime, we can go ahead and prove this one. I don't have any problems with it. But even as this issue calls out, the next one that someone's going to ask for is throw of null or white space.
Does that really get used?
It got used in ASP.NET way back when, but it's a bit weird because like we would always end up calling .trim on the incoming string. And at that point, like it's easier just to call .trim and then do an is null or empty check right afterward.
Well, trim would have already failed at null. But I agree that if you do throw if null and then trim and then check length 0, that's probably what you wanted.
Trim and throw if null or empty.
Basically, yeah. Like just wrap the whole thing. I mean, you laugh, but that's what people want to do, right? Like they want to do the operation and check while performing the operation if it's legit.
I mean, someone can certainly propose string.trim and throw if null or empty, and then we can have the fun 30-minute debate on whether string really wants that type or not, or wants that member or not.
So one question I have is like, what would this API do here when the thing is null? Does it throw argument exception or does it throw argument null exception? Presumably it would throw argument null exception when the value is null, right?
Again, if you use ASP.NET as precedent, it's just argument exception.
In my libraries, I never use argument exception by itself. I consider null to be a null exception and invalid input to be out of range because it's out of the range of allowed values. And so I would want this to, if null, throw argument null, else if empty, throw argument out of range exception. But I could see existing libraries using argument exception for some of it as well.
In AF, we do argument null exception for null and argument exception if it's empty.
Yeah, personally, I don't care too much for empty, I guess. It would just be really weird if an argument was null, but then we didn't throw argument null exception. That just really feels wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I assume because of string is null or empty that lots of places call that and then throw something, whether it be argument out of range or just argument exception, because they're describing two problems. Nobody should really be catching argument null exception as a special thing. So saying that we're nice and we throw argument null exception as a special case here shouldn't break anyone. But I feel that people switching to this helper will probably technically change their exception flows.
Well,
if we start throwing argument null exception, we can never not throw it in the future.
Well, also argument null and argument out of range both inherit from argument exception. So even if people are already only catching argument exception, we can safely throw argument null and argument out of range. They can switch to this and it won't break their flow.
Right, but this is like, assume you have the unit test that passed null and your code right now says if string that is null or empty, throw argument out of range. Now you switch to calling this helper, your unit test fails because we threw argument null exception. So I'm just like,
right.
I'm saying this was probably changing people's exception flows, but since no one should be catching argument null exception, it shouldn't really break anyone other than unit tests. Right. Shouldn't. So I think it's fine to make the distinction. I'll open the door for someone to say we have an extremely optimized implementation of is null or empty and splitting that check into two so we understand if it's null or empty is expensive. Certainly we could also do it on the if is null or empty, if is null, throw argument null exception. So we could, if we think is null or empty is a super fast call, we can make the perf work.
There's going to be no real perf benefit in there anyways, because is null or empty is itself a double conditional, and so you're going to have two checks and a branch no matter what, because you can't get the length without checking if it's null first and then branching if it's null.
Fair enough.
So one reason why I think it might be useful to actually have that distinction is the C# team, I think in the next release, hopefully will add the syntax sugar where you can indicate on a parameter to emit null checking. So I would think that most people will start using that, and that thing will probably, will most certainly throw argument null exception, right? So in the case, it would be weird if you first throw argument exception and then later throw argument null exception again.
Yep. So.
Right. Seems like we're all more or less in agreement on this one.
Yeah, I guess the question, you said otherwise argument exception. Is it argument exception or argument out of range?
Yeah, for the second one, I really don't care. Like if it's empty, I think anything, because we don't really have a dedicated exception for emptiness. I mean, I can live with argument. I can live with argument out of range. They both convey the same information to me. It's just my brain is hardwired. When something is null, I better see an argument null exception.
Yep.
One question would be, so we have argument null exception throw if null, and now we have argument exception throw if null or empty. C# might be adding the syntax to implicitly add the null check, in which case you would want just a throw if empty. Therefore, should we also at the same time as this add a throw if empty? And if we do, we then need to make the decision if it's argument out of range or argument, because that would dictate which class it goes on.
My personal opinion is throw if empty is not noticeably faster enough than throw if null or empty that we would have both.
Yeah, I would probably agree with that.
So yes, you'll get the compiler emitted argument null exception dot throw if null, followed by a manual call to argument exception throw if null or empty, and the second null check is redundant, but if it gets, I guess it won't get inline. That's the whole purpose of this, because you want the throw out of method for JIT reasons.
No, I would expect the null or empty check itself to be inlined and the throw not to be inlined.
Yeah, I'd expect it to be effectively.
So this is a double throw helper?
Yeah, I'd expect it to be an aggressively inlined conditional with a generally not inlined by the JIT throw helper, which actually does the throwing.
Yeah, and that throw helper can figure out which exception to throw, and that incurs more overhead, but who cares, you're about to throw.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so then in that case, if the JIT lifts both of them, then it would see the second null checks redundant and get rid of it.
So one question I have is, like, somebody responded and said, what about an overload that takes I collections? You can do the same thing for arrays. I'm not opposed to that.
No.
We don't have an array is null or empty API, do we? Like I had suggested one a while back and it got shot down.
There isn't. I mean, the question is it common for APIs to throw when an array was null? Oh, sorry, when an array was empty? Probably not either.
Yes,
No,
I actually provided evidence for that inside the issue that I opened, but it still got shot down.
So I think throwing for null is common. I think with the introduction of span, the pattern is now it's less so to throw if empty, because the default state for a read-only span might be empty, and so there's plenty of cases where you'd get an empty and you just want to no-op effectively rather than throw. And the cases where you actually want to throw, where you get an empty input, are exceedingly rare.
Yeah, I was mostly thinking, like, if it's a destination, you throw for not large enough, but you don't really throw for empty, right? It's just that you compare the size to some other value and then you throw out of range.
Yeah, in my library, I've got a throw if 0 helper, and I effectively do in the rare case where I'm expecting there has to be at least one input in a span, I do a throw if 0 span dot length.
Yeah, I guess I originally read that as the inverse thing, which was collection throw if any null. It's like that's just weird. But throwing if the collection itself is null, yeah, I don't feel that that's common enough. A lot of things can certainly run on zero length inputs, but if you pass in null, it's the like, well, you didn't actually express an opinion of what you wanted to do.
All right. So then we go with this.
Yep. And of course, we can always add more later.
All right. Runtime handler should implement IEquatable.
I think we talked about this in the past. Should we just do a pass through everything that it provides an equals method and implement IEquatable?
Yeah, I'm not opposed to that either. I think we did something similar. I remember when we added reflection, we added a bunch of IEquatables to a ton of structs already, so there will be another pass over that.
If we're going to do a pass and find everything that has equals and implements, and therefore should also implement IEquatable, should we also be doing the same thing for comparisons in case there's anything that was missed there, and the equality operators, now that we're going to be having IEquality operators in .NET 7?
Yeah, we could even, like, that might even be an argument to make this an analyzer and to say, like, hey, you've potentially defined a type that has difficult usability.
Yeah.
And that analyzer might even tell us what types we should augment inside our own runtime.
Yeah, there's also iParsable now that we've got that to parity iFormatable.
Well, I mean, the real, like, the design guidelines say if you're making a value type, it should be IEquatable. And then now you need to justify why it's not. So really this is do a pass, find all of our public value types that are not IEquatable, exclude all of the ones that are struct enumerators, and then ask why any of the remaining ones aren't IEquatable. Is what it feels like to me.
Yeah, so it sounds like maybe we want an analyzer here, and then the analyzer can have the condition for enumerators of does not expose a does not implement the IEnumerator interface, or is a ref struct and doesn't implement move next and reset, or whatever the requirements are. Move next and current.
Yeah.
Yep.
I thought we had an analyzer for that, but maybe I'm wrong. But I thought we talked about something like this before.
I feel like FX Cop should have had a design thing that's, hey, you have a value type, it should be IEquatable. I don't know if it said ignore things that say that they're enumerators,
But we're all good with this with this proposal, right?
Unless
I think we
Jeremy, Aaron, somebody who works with these things says there's a reason why they can't be, then yeah. I'm good from a
I think
surface.
it's fine.
Yeah, given who proposed it, I think it's fine.
Fair enough.
Because they implement the equality operator, they implement the equals method.
Yeah.
Yeah, but if someone wanted to say runtime type handle is super special inside the CLR, and if it implements an interface, the world will fall apart because that means it depends on itself, then I would be like, I get it. And if no one wants to assert that, then we can make the change, and if the CLR explodes, not check in. So.
All right. So then I think we can move on to the last one. If Arthur is still around.
Yep, still here. It's been very interesting. Different from my normal stuff. So basically, we have async methods in EF, and we have, for example, toDictionary async, which doesn't actually do anything in terms of translation, but it materializes your results to a dictionary. And we've had people asking for quite a while now to do Lookup async, but there's no way for us to publicly construct a lookup. So we can't do the same thing we do with toDictionary. We would instead have to materialize to some other data structure and then create the lookup synchronously based on that. So the proposal here is just to make the create factory methods on lookup public so that we can call them and we can implement toLookup async.
So there is
Smit has his hand up. Smit is the one who actually really knows how all this stuff works. I'm just a manager, so.
Where do those live today?
System link, this methods.
Yeah, which type, I mean, are they on?
Yeah, there's partial class lookup, which has this create method, which are internal static.
So basically, the methods that I put in the proposal here exist already. They're just internal. I haven't done the analysis to, and Smit maybe knows more to know which overloads we technically really need, as opposed to whether we can get away with not making them all. But from my look at it, it seemed like these two were the ones that made sense to make public.
So remind me again why enumerable.toLookup won't work, because it's a dumb wrapper around these methods and it is public.
So this method wouldn't actually help the async enumerable. We need overloads which take iasync enumerable. So either we add basically toLookup async in system link, which works on iasync enumerable, or somewhere some other namespace, or we need to make the constructor of lookup and get grouping method of lookup class public, so we can asynchronously iterate over async enumerable and construct lookup out of it.
But you're not proposing a new API here. You're proposing making an existing API public, where that existing API already has a public entry point.
It does not have public entry point where you want to iterate over the collection asynchronously.
Right, but you're only proposing making it with IEnumerable instead of async enumerable. There's not adding the new ones here.
Right, you're adding a public API for an API that's already public. That's what's confusing me.
Levi's point is that that first API, the create method, that already exists as enumerable.toLookup with the same arguments. All it does is call this, and just before it does some null checks. So if the goal is to support this with an iasync enumerable, then this API is insufficient. If the goal is to support it with IEnumerable, it already exists.
So the API proposal here is not what we need. It is little incorrect. We need the create method with either iasync enumerable or whatever wrapper over that how toLookup is calling it to this factory method, like toLookup async, which works on iasync enumerable.
So this is just manager error, doing the wrong thing here.
So assume we're not going to add an API that takes an iasync enumerable. What is it that you need?
Constructor on lookup class to be public and get grouping method, which is currently internal on lookup class, that to be public. Then we can construct our own lookup and populate it ourselves.
Which is basically what we do with dictionary, right? We construct a dictionary and then populate it, but we can't do that with a lookup right now.
So what would the constructor of lookup look like?
Currently it's the private constructor with just a comparer.
But you need more than the constructor, right? You need ability to add to it.
Yeah, you need a mutable lookup, don't you?
So the get grouping method on the lookup is giving back a grouping, which we can add elements to. That is how the implementation of lookup is. If there is something else needed, like, yeah, we may need whatever is this create method doing for async enumerable, we need to do exactly same for async enumerable. If we are not adding something new API for async enumerable, then we need to make the code path this is following public, so someone else outside can do the same thing async way.
I think the problem is that lookup is fundamentally an immutable type. And once it's constructed, and what you're actually asking is to make that type mutable rather than immutable.
Right.
And that is a significantly different proposal than what's outlined in this issue here.
Yeah, and Git grouping is effectively public because it's the indexer.
Yeah.
Unless you want to pass create true.
Like it seems to me
So-
like in order to preserve the immutability, you need to drain it into something that is effectively IEnumerable, right? And then you can just use the normal to look up on it again.
So effectively, you're saying then for the people who are requesting to be able to do this, that it's really not possible, and they have to materialize some other kind of collection first, and then create their lookup from that. So they basically have to create two collections in order to do this.
I wouldn't say that it's not possible, but it's given that this type is by construction immutable, like we would need to think very, very, very carefully about how we add mutability characteristics to it. Maybe we end up using a builder concept such that once you use the builder and it allows mutating this instance, and then once you actually get the instance hydrated, the builder is dead and you can no longer change it.
Right.
That would be one way to do it. A mutable array does the same thing. But again, that is a very different API proposal than what's here.
The other option is to do the other alternative, which is add enumerable or async enumerable dot to lookup, where we basically copy this and we do the async enumerable version of it. We've been very sparing about adding async enumerable based things to link because we've kind of delegated that to the world of RX and ironically EF. But maybe if that's what's necessary as a little bit of glue, we do that. I mean, it's a reasonable request to be able to support the same operation without having to make two copies, right? Because going through the enumerable.to lookup is going to make a copy from the input enumerable. So if you have to first materialize your async enumerable into an IEnumerable, by reading the whole thing out into some data structure and then copy it again, that's not ideal either.
Yeah, that's what I mean. At the moment, that's what we tell people you have to do. We've been reluctant to implement to lookup async that does that because I think it's very unexpected that you have that kind of perf characteristic on that. So that's why we're kind of trying to find how we can do that without having to basically enumerate everything twice.
I guess my question is how would you avoid that though? Because you have to drain the async enumerable before you can construct a lookup.
Well, we'd avoid it if we had an async enumerable based create method. We would if you can mutate lookup, which we can do internally, then you just build up the lookup as you read from the enumerable.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So you still drain the async enumerable. It's just that you don't have the
So that's what I was saying about like to dictionary async, right? The end result of that is a fully completed dictionary that has completely drained the, same with to list async in effect, right? It's not that you're trying to then use the lookup or anything asynchronously. It's just that you want to construct it without first constructing another collection which you put it into.
Yeah, I think I prefer the proposal to just have have basically async enumerable dot to lookup. I think that makes more sense than trying to make the constructor.
That's fine.
Here. Even though we most certainly start conflicting with the IX one, but I think that's just the.
We would need to use a different name. We already have some task async enumerable extensions that we put a few things on. I mean, even though the name is terrible, we could put it there and EF could use it.
Yeah, I don't think we need to make it like really easily usable by anything other than people wanting to do to lookup async.
So which type
which
would
EF
this be?
would it provide?
I mean, we could create a new one, or we already have this task async enumerable extensions, where we just added the new to-blocking enumerable, right? Which takes an async enumerable and returns an enumerable. We just added that for 7. So it's an example of a helper that we've kind of buried, that takes an async enumerable and produces something. We could add it there, even though it's not ideal. And we could make it an extension method as well if we wanted to, just like the to-blocking enumerable one is.
Yeah, I guess if our goal is to avoid having a type called async enumerable, then I guess it would probably be, at that point I would probably prefer a factory method on lookup, honestly, because I mean task async enumerable extensions is such a low-level plumbing thing that I think having to look up on that one seems weird.
I mean, if it's extension, nobody really notices where it is.
Yeah, but it still matters, right? Like,
yeah, I know. Is there, so looking at to blocking enumerable, is there a notable difference of what you would get here of calling async enumerable dot to blocking enumerable dot to lookup versus to lookup async?
It would be doing the enumeration with blocking versus not.
Right. It'll, because it hits weight instead of yield. So if the async is already populated, no. If it's not, then yes. Okay.
Which I would presume for EF would be generally no, because the whole point is to avoid that, right?
Yeah,
correct.
Yeah, have we added any helpers for async enumerable other than blocking enumerable?
No, we've been very sparing.
No, we have not.
Okay, because I slightly just wonder if this should just be an overload of, well, I mean, we're going to add the word async to it, but if we should just put it on enumerable.
I mean, I thought on enumerable we have some things that take that, right? That would also be possible, I guess. Apparently we did not. There's not a single overload that takes async enumerable anywhere. I mean, if we want IX to not be bad, I think we should avoid adding anything with async enumerable in such a way that it likely conflicts. So if you put it on enumerable, or if we add our own async enumerable type, then it most likely will end up conflicting.
Yeah, we definitely don't want to conflict there. We've had issues with that in the past, so.
In which case, I'm more leaning towards a factory method, because then it's just, clearly a different name and a different calling pattern.
So just make lookup of
basically
T1, like, T2, create async?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, it's a bit weird because of the generics, but that might be okay.
That is kind of sucky. I mean, I guess if the only people that are calling it are EF and or RX, then they can take the hit of having the T specified redundantly.
Yeah, that's fine. Does that work, Smith?
Yeah.
Steven, happy with that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna go with Arthur's word that it doesn't need to be pretty.
Yeah.
And so if we're doing it here on lookup, we don't need anything special for plink versus link. Or do we? It looks like there's parallel lookup's a non-public type. So create has a couple overloads. Are we going to need any of those?
Smith, do you know?
So create has overload because element selector and comparer are kind of optional. If this API allows to pass them as a null when they're not present, then it should be fine.
Okay, and then there's create for join.
Yeah, that is, we don't need that.
Okay.
I have one question. There is an interface ILookup, which lookup implements, and just looking at plink, its toLookup returns an ILookup. Did we consider just having lookup async return an ILookup?
It does return ILookup. It's the thing that, so the only interface is public. So if we want to implement toLookup async, even if it is returns ILookup, we need to basically copy the whole lookup class and do things asynchronously inside it.
Right. As an implementation detail of lookup async.
Yes.
Right. So that was, I guess we should have pointed about, like, we could just duplicate all of the code, but that seemed like we didn't want to do that. But if that's better.
Well, you wouldn't need all the code. Some of the code is in support of other things, right? Some of the code is in support of being used as an implementation detail of group by or some of the other methods. And you wouldn't
Correct.
need all of the.
But a significant amount of it, right?
Well, some of it, but some of the things like
basically
create for join you don't
duplicating.
need, and some of the things we're duplicating anyway, just with an async version as part of lookup.create, right? We're creating an async overload. So I'm actually not sure how much additional duplication there would be. There might be a lot. It might not be appropriate.
I mean,
but
we could try it and see, and then if it turns out there's a lot of duplication, we can say, hey, actually what we want to do is make these changes here because we're duplicating all of this stuff anyway. What I'm saying is it probably wouldn't be wasted work. It would just be let's see how it looks if we duplicate everything and then decide whether we want to bring it back into the BCL.
I think that'd be a worthwhile experiment before we go and add something that we're not, that's functional but we're not in love with.
Okay.
So basically,
and then as a fallback, we add what Emo has on the screen.
Yeah.
So
and go ahead. Sorry, Emma.
So the proposal is EF would return a custom implementation of ILookup. Is that the idea?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
just like plink does.
I mean, there's the obvious issues with duplicated code and everything. Like if we add things to one place, then we'll make changes in one place. We'll need to make sure that somehow we know to make them consistent and everything. Otherwise, it's going to be really confusing for people. But
that's true. At the same time, I don't think lookups changed in a decade more. So
right. So I think we can give that a try. Certainly. Smith doesn't want to do the work, but that's normal engineers.
I mean, the only thing that I see that looks like it's any real work is the Git grouping. So
okay.
But that feels like it's just a dictionary of list.
You have strong objection to that, trying that, Smith?
No.
Okay, good.
As an engineer, I just don't like duplicating the same code.
Yeah.
Alrighty, looks like we're out of issues then. Anything else?
Wow, thanks, Phil.
Otherwise, we will finish early. Sounds like nobody wants to say something. All right, then I wish you a great day, and I see some of you next week.
Thank you.